The Ghost in the Mirror by John Bellairs, Chapter 8. A good deal of time went by before Heinrich finally had an opportunity to slip the sheet of of fracture writing out of its hiding place in the family Bible. In a household as large as that of the Weiss family, someone was almost always around to notice you slipping into someone else's room. Rosrita nagged at Heinrich to hurry up, but the poor boy just couldn't find an opportunity, and days passed without his getting the prize. Rosrita spent 4 of them traveling around the valley to various farms. She confirmed that the closer the farmers lived to the grouchy old Mr. Stoltzfus, the more they seemed to hate Grandpa Drexel. Other than that one single fact, there seemed little else to learn, since Rosrita wasn't really accomplishing very much. She stayed on the Weiss farm after that. Mrs. Zimmerman still wavered between being lucid and being slightly out of her head, and Rosrita had to protect her against making any terrible mistakes, like asking Mrs. Weiss what she thought of President Truman. But then about the middle of March, Heinrich finally smuggled the mysterious paper out of the stables, and together he and Rosrita inspected it. The fabulous coded message disappointed Rosrita. The paper was old and heavy, creamy brown and dusty smelling. The message was done in red, black, and green ink, in a fancy script with lots of flourishes and curlicues, which made it hard to read. The same inks had been used to draw a complicated floral frame around the words. Rosrita wasted some time in studying this, thinking that maybe the border was some kind of tricky chart. She decided that it was just a bunch of flowers and vines, and the clues must be in the poem itself, not in the floral border around it. But the message was not a map, like in Treasure Island, or an obvious code, like in Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Gold Bug. Instead, with Heinrich's help, Rosrita read a rather poorly done poem. To the sons of liberty, that they might discover the wealth of freedom, step ye sons of freedom smart, live with liberty in your heart. Paces the foe with heavy tread, north your countrymen are lying dead, from Boston, from Concord, from Lexington, cottage and mansion send forth their sons. Rock hard the heart of the British soldier, then harder still are we, the bolder. Line your rebellion with courage brave. Great hearts will live where our flag shall wave. Tree and river shall hide our arms. And as ye bear war's loud alarms, mountain and hill and valley so deep, dig like the fox your den to keep. For if we keep faith, our people true, treasure of liberty must be our due. This fair's made by Heinrich Weiss, MD/CC/LXXVIII, which was the date of the year. The first shall find riches. Well, Rosrita thought, however pretty his handwriting might be, old Heinrich Weiss wasn't much of a speller. Might and wealth and live, indeed, but then she reminded herself, might was spelled M-I-T-E, wealth was spelled W-E-L-T-H, and live was spelled L-I-V, but then she reminded herself he had been an immigrant from Germany and probably had learned English only with difficulty. It does look like a code, she told young Heinrich. But it mentions treasure, the boy said. Right in the title is the word wealth. And after the poem is over, he says that the first to solve it will find the riches. MDCCLXXVIII, Rosrita said. I know those are Roman numerals, but I can't go that high. What is it, an amount of money? No, it's the date, Heinrich said in a surprised voice. It means 1778. That's the year my grandpapa died. My father was only 2 years old. Rosrita had to remind herself that Herman Weiss was only 52 now in 1828. She still could not get out of the habit of thinking the year was 1951. Well, she said, I suppose we ought to copy this. Then we can work on solving the puzzle and not have to worry about your folks noticing that the original is gone. Heinrich went into the house and brought out paper, ink, and a quill pen. Rosrita had some difficulty with this. The tip kept wanting to spread out and drag a big blob of ink down the page, but Heinrich had a penknife and patiently shaped a new point for her several times. Finally, she copied the poem, terrible spelling it all, except that she did it in her normal handwriting. She made no attempt to copy the complex script of the original. Heinrich was able to smuggle the original back into the Bible without anyone being the wiser. The reason that Heinrich could do this was not a comforting one. Grandpa Drexel had gone on treating Mrs. Zimmerman with his herbs and medicines, But he was feeble himself. The strain of trying to help Mrs. Zimmerman was making him worse. Roswitha helped Hilda take care of him on the days when he was so ill that he could hardly stir from his bed. Mrs. Weiss, who fluttered all around the house, usually talking a mile a minute, sometimes had to feed her stepfather. It was while she was serving him meals that Heinrich slipped the paper in and out of Mr. and Mrs. Weiss's bedroom. Roswitha was very concerned about Mr. Drexel's health. Of course, he had promised to create a magic charm that would bring back Mrs. Zimmerman's witchy powers, but aside from that, Roswitha had become fond of the old man. He was always gentle and understanding, and on the increasingly rare days when he was not feeling terribly ill, he had a great sense of humor. Inside, he was more like one of the rowdy Weiss children than an old fellow. It hurt Roswitha to see him lying in bed pale and weak, with a tired, pained look on his face. Roswitha knew that Hilda was very worried too. One night, as they lay in Hilda's room, with only the red embers of the fire giving any light, Hilda whispered to Roswitha that she feared her grandfather was the victim of an evil curse. Roswitha was quiet for a long time. A couple of years earlier, she would have told Hilda that evil curses and wicked witches were nonsense, that they didn't exist. But being a friend of Mrs. Zimmerman and Jonathan Barnevelt's meant that Roswitha had seen some pretty weird events. She knew that some people could indeed use magic, and she had discovered that evil people could use magic for wicked purposes. Now she said, "Is that what your grandpa thinks, Hilda?" "Yes," said Hilda in a weepy voice. "He thinks someone must have made a hex doll of him." Roswitha had heard a little about this. She knew that those who wanted to practice harmful magic sometimes made images of people they wished to injure. Mrs. Zimmerman had told her once that an evil witch might use a photograph of an enemy in a ceremony that harmed the picture and also harmed the victim. A voodoo doll was like that. It was a small wax effigy made by a witch doctor to resemble some living person. The witch doctor then stuck the doll full of pins. The victim was then supposed to suffer illness or excruciating pain in the same part of his or her body where the pins were stuck. She guessed that a hex doll was pretty much the same thing. "I bet I know who would do that," she said. "Old Stoltzfus." Then a strange thing happened. Roswitha's tongue seemed to stick in her mouth. She could say nothing more about Stoltzfus. When she struggled to talk, her mind whirled, and in a moment she could not remember who she had been talking about. "I don't know," Hilda said. For a long time she lay sobbing quietly. Roswitha tried to think of something that would cheer Hilda. The two girls had shared a room for about a month, and they had gradually come to be almost like sisters. Even Mrs. Weiss, with her talkative, fussy ways, tended to treat Roswitha just like another member of the large family by this time, so Roswitha knew the kinds of things Hilda liked to talk about. After many minutes had passed, Roswitha asked, "Will there be any frolics this spring?" She knew the Penn Dutch called dances frolics, and she knew that Hilda eagerly looked forward to finally being old enough to go to one. "Everything has been so bad this winter. I don't know," Hilda said. After a pause, she added, "I hope there will be. My oldest sister, Trinka, told me all about them." "Uh-huh," Roswitha said. She had heard bits and pieces of this story before because it was one that Mrs. Weiss liked to tell over and over. She yawned. She was really sleepy, but she decided to try and stay awake long enough to be sure that Hilda's mind was off hexes and evil wizards and voodoo dolls. "Trinka met her husband at a frolic, didn't she?" "Yes," Hilda said. Her voice was a little dreamy. Roswitha got the idea that she was fond of her oldest sister's husband, a young man named Edgar Deinst. She was 17. Edgar was visiting his uncle in the valley, and he came to the frolic with his cousins. Edgar was 20 then. When Trinka saw him, she thought he was the most handsome man in the world, and when Edgar saw her, he told his cousins that this was the girl he wanted to marry, and sure enough, 1 year later, they did get married. I wore the prettiest dress." Hilda sighed in contentment. She thought her sister's courtship was just like a fairy tale. She asked Roswitha, "Have you ever been to a frolic?" Roswitha asked. "Once, last year." "Was it wonderful?" Roswitha was glad the room was dark. Her face was burning hot, and she knew she was blushing. Darn it, why did she have to bring up the subject of dancing? Maybe it was a pleasant one for Hilda, but Roswitha didn't care. She never went to a dance or even talked about one for the rest of her life. However, she said, "It was all right, I guess. She broke off. The idea was to cheer Hilda up, not to complain. "It was all right," Roswitha said again. "What happened?" Hilda asked. "Tell me all about it. What did everyone wear? Where was the frolic?" "Well, it was in the school gymnasium. There was a band, and everyone dressed up." "What is a gymnasium?" "Oh, it's a building that our school has for games and things when it's too cold to go outside. It's very cold where I come from." Rosarita pondered whether or not to throw in polar bears wandering the streets of New Zebedee in the wintertime. But before she could make up her mind whether or not this would be a good touch, Hilda had another question. What did you wear? Rosarita sighed. She was in for it now. She described the pink party dress that her mother had bought for her, down to every flounce and lace. Rosarita hadn't been any too sure about that dress. With all the frills and lace, it was just too girlish for her to feel comfortable in it, but she had worn it, and her description of it thrilled Hilda. It sounds so pretty. You must have danced with every boy there, Hilda said. No, Rosarita sighed again. In fact, I didn't dance at all. I was a wallflower. Then she had to explain what that meant. She had been one of the girls who stood against the wall, waiting for a boy to ask her to dance. Only no boy had done that. Louis had been there, standing across the gym floor with a bunch of other boys. And Rosarita had tried to signal him that she wanted to dance at least once, for crying out loud. But Louis kept looking away, and in the end, neither of them danced at all. Rosarita had been so mad that she had hardly spoken to Louis for more than a week, and even after that, she had never once talked to him about the humiliating dance. Don't be so hard on your friend Louis. Maybe he just doesn't know how to dance, Hilda said when Rosarita had finished telling the whole ghastly story. By that time, Rosarita was really awake, because just telling the story made her angry all over again. I never thought of that, she admitted, surprised she hadn't. You ought to offer to teach him, Hilda murmured. Then he wouldn't be so bashful next time. Her voice trailed off, and soon she was asleep. But now Rosarita couldn't go to sleep. She lay awake brooding about the dance and how she had yelled at her mother when she got home afterward. I hate dances, she had shouted. Dances are stupid, and dresses are stupid, and I'm never going again. And she had crammed the pretty dress down in the very bottom of the hamper when her mother had washed and ironed it. Her mother had washed and ironed it, but Rosarita had refused to wear it again. The pink dress was still hanging in her closet, next to all her sweatshirts and jeans. Or rather, it would be hanging there in about 123 years, Rosarita realized. Despite her problems, she could not help smiling. She had worked herself up so much over the stupid dance that she had almost forgotten all the trouble she and Mrs. Zimmerman were in. She snuggled deeper into the bed, and with warm quilts over her and the regular sound of Hilda's breathing lulling her, she eventually fell asleep. And that is the end of chapter 8.